Things were not looking very good for me after the first few turns of my first tournament game of Warhammer The Old World. Before the game even began, a few unfortunate rolls left me in a terrible position on an already unfavorable map. And before I even had a chance to act, my opponent's cannons destroyed my grudge thrower with a single well-placed shot. Then, in the turn after that, they brought my Anvil of Doom down to only a single wound. Worse still, my opponent knew that from this position, all he had to do was sit back and wait. So my beleaguered dwarves had no choice but to march up the field and risk being outmaneuvered by the swift steeds of the Bretonnians. The situation was looking pretty bleak, but no dwarf worth his salt gives up at the first sign of hardship. So, did I manage to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat? Find out today on Runeforged. Today I'm going to be going over my first ever tournament game of Warhammer The Old World, which I played online using warhall.eu. If you'd like to find out more about Warhall, there is a link down in the description. This was a 2,000 point battle between my Dwarven Royal Clan and my opponent's Bretonnian Exiles. A quick overview of our list should be on the screen now, and you can find the full list down in the description. All right, so let's take a look at this deployment and see what we're working with. Already, I kind of feel like I'm in a pretty bad spot here. It definitely looks like my opponent has the range advantage over me, and if he realizes that, I think I'm going to have a really hard time making it across the field, largely because of the extreme amount of terrain that lies between me and him. Honestly, I was really banking on him just not realizing that he had a range advantage and that he would follow the what seems to be the pretty stereotypical Bretonnian maxim of always be charging. But at the time, I did not realize that my opponent was a very experienced and knowledgeable tournament player. So that is not how things would be turning out. Also in this deployment, I am pretty worried about the Green Knight, who is not on the board yet. He can pop up from any of the natural terrain features, which in this case is going to be any of these woods. But he does have to pop up wholly within the terrain feature and more than 1 inch away from any of my units. Unfortunately, he is able to charge on the turn he comes in, so he is very dangerous. Especially considering my army doesn't have a whole lot of magical damage in order to deal with him. My king has a magical weapon, and the Anvil of Doom has a magic missile, but that is pretty much it. I was definitely a little bit flustered during my deployment phase. I actually had spent like several hours the previous day kind of planning out deployments for the various different tournament maps. But unfortunately, some of the maps were changed after I'd already done all of my prep. So I wasn't super well prepared for all the maps. Also, one thing that I didn't realize at the time was that all the woods on this map are not only difficult terrain, but they're also dangerous terrain. And that made my plan of trying to block out this woods from the Green Knight a lot more dangerous than I thought it was going to be. So basically, this entire unit of Longbeards is going to end up taking some dangerous terrain tests, and that is extremely dangerous for such a large unit. Also, it's worth noting that chariots, which the dwarf cart is classified as, don't really like being in woods all that much, and they do suffer some additional penalties above and beyond what normal units would suffer. So that is something to keep in mind for later. But after several minutes of deliberation, I did ultimately end up going with my original plan for deployment. I just decided that I would go ahead and eat those difficult terrain tests, largely because Longbeards have the Rune of Passage on them, which makes them a little bit better at coping with difficult and dangerous terrain. As far as the threats that I'm worried about in my opponent's army, definitely the Pegasus Knights with this Baron in it on the Royal Pegasus is probably almost certainly the biggest threat that his army has to offer. And also, I am very concerned about his cannons. So basically, my primary plan during this game is to try and weaken this unit of Pegasus Knights as much as I can with my shooting, and then try to get my king and whatever unit he happens to be in into combat with the Pegasus Knights. And I feel pretty confident that if I can do that, I will be able to win that fight. And if I can ever get his Baron in a challenge with my king, or even if I can just get in base to base with him, I do feel pretty confident that my king will be able to take the Baron out. Largely because his Great Axe is inscribed with the Rune of Smiting, which gives him 1d6 damage for each unsaved wound. So he's a very, very dangerous combat character. Also very tanky in addition to all that. I am also really concerned about his cannons as well. Unfortunately, in this tournament, it was ruled that the Master Rune of Adamant on the Anvil only applies to the crew profile and not to the Anvil profile. So those cannons are actually a huge threat to my Anvil, which is why you see me trying to hide it up here in the corner. Also, I'm very worried about the cannons getting into my grudge thrower, my dwarf cart, and also any units that I have arranged in multiple ranks, like you see the longbeards right here. And unfortunately, I don't really feel like I have a great answer for these cannons. Maybe I'll get a lucky hit with my grudge thrower, or maybe by some miracle, my dwarf cart might make it into their back line, and maybe I can destroy the cannons that way. But at the time, I'm thinking, there's probably not much of a reasonable chance that I am going to get into the back line, because he is very well defended by his yeoman guard as well as the bowman. So I figure that's pretty much a pipe dream, but it is something I'm going to be shooting for throughout the course of the game. But the good news, at least in my mind at the time, is that my Anvil of Doom should be out of line of sight of these cannons, and he should be safe from being shot. In retrospect, this huge block of yeomen might also be a pretty significant problem. They do have a massive amount of static combat res, which means it's going to be really difficult to shift them in a fight. And also, I don't really think it's reasonable that I'm going to be able to take them out with shooting, largely because there are so many other much more important and juicier targets that I'd like to be shooting instead. If that unit of yeomen is able to get into my army and hold down one of those units, that's going to make those units even more susceptible to a flank or rear charge from either the Pegasus Knights or the mounted Knights of the Realm. But because they're so far away, my plan is really just to ignore them and hope that they never actually get into the battle. Or at the very least that they maybe show up late after I've been able to deal with some of the higher priority units. So to summarize, my overall game plan is to put as much shooting as I can into the Pegasus Knights to weaken them, and then get into close combat with the Pegasus Knights with my king and whatever unit he happens to be in, and hopefully he can manage to finish them off. And in the meantime, I'll just be trying to dodge as many cannonballs as possible, and maybe through some sort of stroke of luck, I might be able to even pick one or both cannons off with either the grudge thrower or the dwarf cart. I will say in the maybe 4 to 5 games of Old World that I have played already, the dwarf cart actually hasn't managed to do a single point of damage to anything so far. And I'm eager to see if in this game we can break the streak. So let's go ahead and move into turn 1. I do have a screenshot missing here of the result of Bretonnian turn 1, but we'll go over it now, and then we'll talk about the dwarves. Luckily for me, the Green Knight does not show up in the first turn, which gives me a little bit of a reprieve for now. In terms of movement, my opponent shifts basically his entire army away from me as far as possible, which is a really bad sign for me, as that is my clue that he is aware that he has the range advantage in this matchup. Moving on to my opponent's shooting phase, he is able to take out 3 Longbeards and my Grudge Thrower with a well-placed cannon shot, which does mean that there is enough room for the Green Knight now to pop up in this wooded area. So it is even more dangerous for me than it already was. And I think the last important thing that happens in my opponent's turn is that he's able to successfully cast a Pillar of Fire quite close to my Longbeards. And spoiler alert, this is going to be a bit of a problem for me pretty much for the rest of the game. So moving on into Dwarf Turn 1, I do feel like I am in a little bit of a pickle in this situation. I'm really torn between either trying to move forward and kind of risk getting outmaneuvered, or just sitting still and kind of acknowledging my loss and just trying to minimize those losses as much as possible. And then really just hope that my opponent maybe overextends in some sort of attempt to score some more points off of my army. Ultimately in this turn, I do decide to move forward with my forces, but I am a little bit hesitant to do so, and I don't fully commit to that course of action. In retrospect, if I was really committed to going on the attack here, I probably should have taken some time to put my units into marching column before I started moving them across the board. It's also worth noting that I had to take some dangerous terrain checks this turn, most notably on that unit of Longbeards. So initially when I rolled those dangerous terrain tests, I think I actually got like something like 7 ones on that first roll, which was, perhaps an omen of things to come. But luckily I did take the Rune of Passage on that unit, which gives them move through cover. And that means that they could re-roll any failed dangerous terrain checks. And I ended up only losing 1 model overall. So most likely the most efficient 5 points that I've spent in my army. And that's pretty much the end of Dwarf Turn 1. Because I don't have any shooting that is in range. All right, so moving into Bretonnian Turn 2, the Green Knight does manage to pop up from this woods over here in my deployment zone and immediately charges the Dwarven cart. And as you might expect, I immediately flee from the Green Knight's charge and do manage to evade him for at least 1 more turn. In terms of movement, my opponent continues to maneuver his army away from me as much as possible. Meanwhile, moving these Pegasus Knights up to threaten my left flank. In my opponent's shooting phase, the unthinkable happens and he manages to line up some clean shots on my anvil. Unfortunately, it was still in line of sight and I needed to nudge it over about 1 or 2 more inches in order for it to be mostly safe. And a single cannonball ends up dealing 4 wounds to that anvil. You will notice here it says 3, but that's just a display bug. I have lost 4 wounds and I am down to 1 remaining. And that's really scary because that anvil is worth over 300 points, which would cement a very solid victory for my opponent if I'm not able to score any points. So yes, the end of Bretonnian Turn 2. Things are definitely not looking very good for the dwarves. All right, so moving on to Dwarf Turn 2. You know, as much as I would love to say that this is all a plot to lull my opponent into a false sense of security, I am actually floundering pretty hard at this point. I decide to move the cart closer to the table edge. At this point, just basically trying to act as a distraction. Maybe buying me just a little bit more time in order to get my forces into place. At this point, my strategy does start to shift, and I am no longer as confident going into my opponent, and I start to think that maybe the right move is to kind of move backwards and maybe form a line here using this impassable terrain feature to anchor my flank down here. So I do end up moving the Longbeards back just a little bit, and I end up trying to move the Iron Drakes so that I can take up a position over here. Also, by moving these Iron Drakes closer towards the cannons, that does give them a much more difficult shot at trying to kill my anvil. And I think shortly after this, my opponent gives up on trying to make that shot, and instead just ends up putting the cannons into the Iron Drakes instead. All right, moving into Bretonnian Turn 3. Both the Green Knight and the unit of Pegasus Knights do attempt to charge into the Dwarf Cart, but again, I flee and manage to not only outpace them, but avoid running off the edge of the map, so definitely some good luck on my part. I'm sure you can imagine some Benny Hill music playing in the background as this is happening. Also, the Yeomen are moving up the field towards my unit of Longbeards, and the Pillar of Fire manages to pick up another kill on the Longbeards. RIP. That's pretty much all for Bretonnia Turn 3. Moving into Dwarf Turn 3. As you can see, the cart continues to evade, moving down the side of the board. Hopefully I can achieve my goal of threatening these cannons by the end of the game. And basically just tempting the Pegasus Knights and the Green Knight to see if they want to spend any more time chasing this cart. Hopefully giving me a little bit more time to reform my line closer to my side of the field. I turn the Longbeards around so that I can begin the march back to create a more solid line. And the Iron Drakes again move forward, hopefully so that I can threaten some shooting in the next turn. Also, again, making this cannon shot on my anvil even more difficult than it already is. So at this point, I am very much entrenched in my strategy of just trying to deny as many points as possible. And again, hopefully my opponent will overextend and put himself into a difficult position. So moving into Bretonnian Turn 4, looks like my opponent has given up on the idea of chasing this cart anymore, and he is now angling for this unit of Longbeards that has its back turned to him. The only other notable thing that happens in this turn is that the Pillar of Fire takes out 3 more of my Longbeards. All right, so moving into Dwarf Turn 4, through a string of somewhat ridiculous maneuvers, I do manage to get my Longbeards back into a more reasonable position. And I'm also able to expand my frontage to get some additional Longbeards into the fight, should they be charged next turn by the Pegasus Knights and or the Green Knight. So basically in order to do that, I drilled to get into marching column. I went as far back as I could towards my own lines. Then I was able to use the anvil to get another move on this unit of Longbeards, and I used that to reform, basically pivoting 180 degrees and then expanding my frontage as much as I felt comfortable doing. In retrospect, I wonder if I could have actually gone a little bit wider on my reform and put more Longbeards in this line, knowing that even if they weren't in base-to-base contact with the enemy, I would still be able to get those swings in. So I wonder if I could have gone a little bit wider up top here. Also, very crucially, I was able to move my king from the Iron Drakes into my unit of Longbeards. This is a really important thing, as he is like probably the key piece of my army that's going to enable me to deal with these Pegasus Knights in the event that they do end up charging into me. Also, very crucially, I was able to get the armor buff from the anvil onto the Longbeards, so they are now about as prepared as they could possibly be for the inevitable charge from the Bretonnians. The only thing that didn't quite work out is I was not able to get my Runesmith / Battle Standard Bearer from the Iron Drakes into the Longbeards, simply because he didn't have enough movement to get there. If he had, that would also end up giving that unit a 5-up ward save, which would be really, really helpful against what's coming. I also go ahead and wheel my Iron Drake slightly to get a better line of fire on the Pegasus Knights. And I am able to score a single wound on the Pegasus Knights, I believe with one of the Drake guns. maybe not as much damage as I would have liked, but it is a big psychological win because now the dwarves are starting to smell Bretonnian blood in the water. All right, so moving into Bretonnia Turn 5. As you can see, the Pegasus Knights and the Green Knight go ahead and charge into my unit of Longbeards. I do think it's really interesting that my opponent did take a pretty long time to decide whether or not he wanted to make this charge. And I think it's good that he spent some time thinking about it because this is actually very dangerous for him. The upside is that if he's able to wipe this unit, that's, I think, almost 1,000 victory points. It's like 500 or so for the Longbeards. It's like a little over 300 for the king. He also gets an additional 100 victory points for the king being my general, as well as there's a standard in that unit that he can get an additional, I think, 50 victory points off of. So this unit is worth a ton of victory points. Now the downside is that this unit of Pegasus Knights, including the Baron, is also very, very expensive from a victory point perspective. The Pegasus Knights on their own are worth 431 victory points, and the Baron by himself is 300. Plus an additional 100 for being the army's general, plus an additional 75 because I used my Royal Clan Striking a Grudge special rule on him as well. So overall, that unit is worth almost 900 points. And if I do manage to destroy this unit, which is very possible, especially if my king does roll well, that's going to swing the game wildly back into my favor. I definitely respect my opponent's boldness in making this charge. It was definitely a little bit of a gamble, but secretly I was definitely praying that he would charge into me because this was really my opportunity to bring the game back under my control. So yes, this was the moment that I had been waiting for since the start of the game, but we'll get to that combat in just a minute. Also this turn, my opponent's Knights of the Realm did kind of catapult across the board, trying to threaten my cart, which is itself threatening the cannons. The Knights were able to get here with the help of Arcane Urgency from my opponent's Wizard. And also the Yeoman turnaround, also to help counter the threat of the Dwarf cart. But unfortunately for them, it's already too late because my cart is in charge range of those cannons. All right, so let's go ahead and get back to that close combat between the Longbeards and the Pegasus Knights. I did want to note that the Pegasus Knights did lose a wound on the way in due to the dangerous terrain of the forest here, which is certainly a good start to this combat. I did elect for my Longbeards to use their hand weapon and shields here instead of their great weapons, which gives them a 3-up rerollable save because of the Rune of Oath and Steel from the Anvil. And just as I had hoped, the Longbeards did manage to hold the line, only losing 4 Longbeards during this fight. Unfortunately, one of those was the champion, who lost in a challenge to the Pegasus Knight champion. In return, I did manage to cut down 2 of the Pegasus Knights. And as a result of the high static combat res on my unit of Longbeards, plus the additional wounds that I did to the Pegasus Knights, I was able to pursue back into them after they fell back in good order, which means that I would have the charge on the next turn. All right, so it is at this point that I am starting to get very, very excited about the state of this game. As you can probably remember, at the beginning of this game, things were not looking good for the dwarves. And now, after a relatively successful turn of combat, I was able to put the Pegasus Knights on the back foot. And if you're enjoying this video so far, please consider aiding me in my eternal struggle against the dreaded YouTube algorithm by crushing those like and subscribe buttons so you don't miss out on more awesome old world content like this in the future. All right, so moving into Dwarf Turn 5. The time has come for the Dawi to prove their mettle once and for all. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you, I was feeling pretty confident at this point. I think I do have a winning position at this point in the game, and I am very eager to jump into this combat and see how much damage I'm going to be able to inflict on the enemy. But before that happens, we need to resolve my opponent's Pillar of Flame. It did go through both the Green Knight and my unit of Longbeards, and I ended up losing 2 of my guys, and I think the Green Knight also ended up taking a wound here. It may not reflect until a little bit later in the game. Also, in retrospect, kind of as my opponent pointed out to me at the end of the game, I probably should have charged the Green Knight here with my unit of Iron Drakes. Honestly, in the moment, it really didn't even cross my mind because nothing in this unit has magic weapons, and I was thinking that there's no way that I could actually hurt the Green Knight. My opponent did point out that I actually have a pretty fair amount of static combat resolution in this unit, and had I charged, it might have been difficult for the Green Knight to actually win that combat. But unfortunately, I didn't think about that in the moment, as I was too caught up on some other juicier charges. Yes, we are deep into turn 5 of this game, and somehow this heroic, dare I say, Chadley Dwarf Cart is still alive and is threatening my opponent's back line. And his time has come. He declares his charge into the cannons. But there is a bit of a problem. The cannons are situated in dangerous terrain, which is doubly dangerous for my chariot. So problem number 1 is that when I am charging across difficult terrain, I'm going to be taking the lower of 2d6 when I'm making my charge rolls, which means I'm going to need to roll a 4 or higher on both dice in order to succeed on this charge. And then problem number 2 is, even if I succeed in my charge, if I enter the wood in any capacity, I am going to have to take a dangerous terrain test. And if I fail, I'm not just taking 1 wound, but I'm taking D3 wounds instead. So that means, in theory, even if I do manage to successfully complete this charge, there is a non-zero chance that the dwarf cart blows itself up on the way in, which wouldn't exactly be ideal. But if we're being completely honest, there is no way that I am not attempting this charge. This heroic dwarf cart has not made it all the way to this moment, just to lose its bravery at the very last second. So I go ahead and roll my difficult terrain check, and I ended up rolling double 6s. Fate has spoken, the cart has made it in. But I also have to roll my dangerous terrain check. And wouldn't you know it, I rolled a 1. But never to fear, you can't make a good omelet without breaking a few eggs. So all I have to do is roll my D3, and I only have a 33% chance of completely destroying the cart. So not too worried at this point. I go ahead and roll my D3. Yes, you are correct. Fate has spoken once again, and I rolled a 3, which unfortunately means the untimely demise of our heroic dwarven cart. I'm not gonna lie, that one stung just a little bit, but you know what? That's Warhammer. And I could take some solace in the fact that the main course was about to be served. Tonight, we were going to be having Pegasus. All right, so as just a reminder, during the last turn, the Pegasus Knights did fall back in good order, and my Dwarven Longbeards were able to pursue and get back into them, which means that my Longbeards do count as charging on this turn. And because of the Royal Clan special rule, they all have +1 strength on this charge. So I am hoping to do a significant amount of damage on this turn. So yes, this is the moment that I've been waiting for, and I must convert on this combat if I have any hope of winning this game. In theory, my king could actually take out all of the normal Pegasus Knights on his own, should he get a lucky series of rolls. Unfortunately, my opponent very wisely issues a challenge with his Pegasus Knight champion, and since there are no champions or other characters left in the Longbeards, I have no choice but to accept with my king. Now, the king does make short work of the Pegasus Knight champion, but that also means that the additional wounds that he could possibly have dealt to the other Pegasus Knights are no longer possible. I end up losing only 2 Longbeards during this combat, but unfortunately, I am only able to take out 2 Pegasus Knights in return. But well played to my opponent for recognizing the precarious situation I was in relative to challenges. In the end, I do manage to win this combat, forcing my opponent to give ground, but because he is already in terrain, he doesn't need to push back any further. So overall, not a terrible round of combat, but certainly not the decisive victory that I was hoping for. All right, moving into Bretonnian Turn 6. Most notably, the Green Knight does charge into the flank of the Longbeards. This round, I end up losing 4 Longbeards in this combat, and unfortunately, I pretty much whiff all of my attacks during this turn, and I only managed to inflict a single wound. So definitely a little bit unlucky during this turn of combat. I think I end up losing the combat by 3, plus the enemy's Green Knight causes terror, and I am double outnumbered, which means that I need to roll a 6 or less on 2d6 in order not to flee outright from this combat. And I also have a Battle Standard Bearer in range, which means I get to reroll that result one more time. Unfortunately, I do manage to fail both those rolls, and that entire unit does break and flee. And to no one's surprise, my opponent is able to ride them down and completely wipe out that very expensive unit in my army. Also, unfortunately, basically right as this is happening, my power decided to go out, because if you're not aware, there is somehow like blizzard level conditions in the Florida Panhandle right now, which I don't think anyone would have seen coming. And it was a little bit of unfortunate timing, but again, at this point, the game had pretty much already been decided. Luckily, I was able to get power back about 20 minutes later, and we were able to finish up the game. Unfortunately, I don't have any screenshots after this point, as my power did go out. But basically what happened is the Pegasus Knights and Green Knights ran down the Longbeards. I did get one more round of shooting into my opponent. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to do much. I think I managed to take out one more Pegasus Knight, which was definitely not as effective as I'd hoped it would be. But it did bring that unit of Pegasus Knights down to below 25% unit strength, which means I at least get some points for hurting that unit. So after we tallied up the final score, my opponent managed to score 1,166 victory points to my 108, which led to a total battle score of 15 points for my opponent and 5 points for me, which is a lot closer than I was expecting it to be, especially after the first part of the game. All right, so let's talk a little bit about my takeaways from this game. So to start off, I think I definitely made some errors with my deployment. As my opponent pointed out after the game, if I was intent on attacking, I think that I probably should have started the game in marching column. That would have gone a long way towards helping me be more maneuverable and get to my opponent faster if that was the route that I decided to go. Also, kind of unfortunately, I did misplace my anvil slightly. I should have bumped it over another inch or two to make it much more difficult to get a good angle on it for the cannons. Next, just kind of thinking about this very pivotal fight between the Pegasus riders and my Longbeards. I'm really not sure that it was the right play for me to use my hand weapons and shields as opposed to my great weapons. In a previous game, I made the opposite mistake and used great weapons when I should have used hand weapons and shields, but that was only because that didn't allow me to use my shield wall ability, which would have let me give ground instead of fall back in good order. And as a result of not being able to do that, I was pushed off of the table edge during my fallback. In this situation, there really wasn't any risk of me running off the table. So I wonder if it might have been a better idea for me to use the great weapons instead, as that would allow me to wound the Pegasus Knights on 2s as opposed to wounding them on 4s. Also, it would have given me some additional armor penetration, which would have helped to penetrate the Pegasus Knight's armor. The downside is that I might have lost a few more Longbeards during this combat, but honestly, that might have been worth it. Also, I'm not sure that I played the challenge game correctly during this fight. I guess there's definitely an argument for me accepting the first challenge with my king and just kind of eating that first round of combat to take that Pegasus Knight champion off the table. So then I could issue a challenge into his Baron in the following turn. Or at the very worst, I get a challenge with the Green Knight. And I should be able to handle either of those opponents fairly easily, assuming the dice don't turn against me in that moment. But I think by far the biggest mistake that I made during this game was not charging the Iron Drakes into the Green Knight when I had the opportunity to do so. Honestly, the thought didn't even cross my mind because I don't have any magical weapons in this unit, and that's the only thing that can hurt the Green Knight. But I think I just didn't even think about the concept of winning purely on combat resolution and inflicting damage on the Green Knight through the unstable special rule, which makes him take a wound for each point of combat resolution that he loses a combat by. This was actually a really critical mistake because if I had charged into him and won that combat and been able to follow up into him, that would have prevented him from getting the side charge into the Longbeards in the next turn. And this charge by the Green Knight into the Longbeards here was absolutely pivotal in me losing this fight. Not only did he inflict some damage on the Longbeards, he also got an additional point of combat resolution for being in my flank. And he also contributed to me being double outnumbered, which is the reason I ended up fleeing from that combat as opposed to falling back in good order. So I do actually think it's pretty reasonable to say that if I'd been able to prevent the Green Knight from making this charge, the chances of me winning this combat go up dramatically. And if I do win that combat, I think there's a very good chance that I go on to win the game overall, which would have been a really exceptional feeling, especially given how far behind I was, or at least felt, at the beginning of the game. So unfortunately, a big misplay for me in the final turns of the game, but it was definitely a good learning experience. And this is an excellent lesson for the future that I should not be underestimating the power of static combat res, even more so in the context of trying to defeat enemies with the unstable special rule. So I think despite a rough beginning and arguably an even rougher ending, this was an absolutely amazing game of Warhammer. And I think this is probably the most fun game of Warhammer that I've played since I've come back. I also wanted to give a quick shout out to my opponent, who seemed like a truly awesome dude. Not only was he extremely knowledgeable about the rules, but he was also incredibly friendly and patient as I kind of bumbled my way through the game. I did find out after our game that he is a very experienced and knowledgeable tournament player who has some pretty extensive experience playing against the type of list that I ran in this game. And that definitely made me feel a little bit better about the game overall. But again, overall, a really enjoyable game. And I can't wait for tournament game number 2. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider checking out this next battle report, which should be popping up on your screen right about now. But I think that's about it for now. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day.